2024 Space Studies program. This evening, we have a very special guest to discuss space initiatives, an effective tool for international diplomacy, Mr. James Bridenstine. James Bridenstine served as NASA's 13th administrator. He represented Oklahoma's 1st congressional district in the House of Representatives and flew combat missions as a naval aviator in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Under his leadership at NASA, America returned to once again launching American astronauts from American rockets from American soil and introduced NASA's new human lunar exploration initiatives called Artemis. In Congress, he served on the Armed Services Committee and the Science and Space Technology Committee. Jim provides strategic guidance and consultant services to companies pursuing opportunities in commercial and civil space, national security, financial services, and technology development. He is a dynamic speaker and enjoys working closely with executive leaders to define and drive company growth. Additionally, he serves in multiple corporate boards and invests a great deal of his personal time to the community. Finally, Bridenstine completed a triple major in a very, very prestigious university called Rice University. Please help me welcome James Bridenstine.
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction. By show of hands, I know David Alexander has a connection to Rice University beyond the ISU program here. Anybody else connected to Rice, whether employee, student? All right, we got a few, fantastic. So just so you are all aware, I was at Rice University in 1994 when Rice University defeated the University of Texas in American football. There you go. Some of you in this room are probably familiar with that speech that was given by John F. Kennedy right here at this university in 1962, where he asked a whole bunch of really tough questions. One of those tough questions is, why does Rice play Texas? And I'll tell you, he was saying, well, why climb the highest mountain? Why fly across the ocean? Why do we do these things? Because they're hard. Why go to the moon? Because it's hard. That was his point. One of the questions he asked is, why does Rice play Texas? And I am happy to tell you that Rice plays Texas because when we do, we win. That's why we play Texas. And after we beat them in 1994, they decided, look, we can't have Rice beating us anymore, so they quit the Southwest Conference. They joined this conference called the Big 12, fundamentally changed college football, but it's because Rice University crushed them in American football. I see some shaking of the heads here. Is this a University of Texas fan I see shaking her head? Oh, no, you got to be. So I was there in 1994 on the sidelines with the big green dish because it was live on television, ESPN, and yes, Texas did get embarrassed. So, all right, I'll stop talking about that. I am Jim Bridenstine. I'm a graduate of Rice University. I joined the United States Navy after graduating from Rice, which people ask me, why did you go to Rice? You studied economics and business. I picked up a third major, psychology, and then I joined the Navy. Why would you do that? Well, I will just tell you that I needed a little more excitement in my life. I watched the movie Top Gun when I was in 5th grade. Anybody familiar with Top Gun? So after watching that movie in 5th grade and all those years later, graduating from college, I decided that's what I wanted to do. I spent 9 years on active duty in the Navy. I did fly at Top Gun. I flew Red Air. So my job was to be a target to get shot down by Top Gun instructors. And I did that bravely every day. I went up, get shot down, and come home. When you get shot down, you get to fly home at under 500 feet and faster than Mach, so that wasn't terribly disappointing. And then do it again the next day. So it was a good experience. After finishing my time in the Navy, I went back to Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was my hometown. We got a Tulsan in the room? All right. Just one, huh? 2. We got a couple of them. Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you for being here. I won't tell you about the times that Rice played the University of Tulsa. Those outcomes were not so good. But for Rice, probably for Tulsa. So let's see, I ran a nonprofit museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We put on a big air show called the Tulsa Air and Rocket Racing Show. There might be some people in the room familiar with an organization called the Rocket Racing League. Anybody here familiar with the Rocket Racing League? We got some. So you guys are probably as old as I am, so that's good. So the idea was we want to race rocket-powered airplanes in a three-dimensional track in the sky. My goal in those days was, how do you advance rocket science and space technology in the private sector apart from the whimsical budgets of politicians? Politicians are terrible. I'm just telling you, they're terrible. And I can say that because I was one. And when I say they're terrible, what I mean is that, they start programs and they stop programs and they fight over programs, and they're all doing it for their own parochial interest and their political interest and not trying to do what ultimately we're trying to achieve, either as a nation or collectively when we think about our international partnerships. So we've seen programs start and stop and start and stop, and so I got involved. I said, look, if we can take the business model of NASCAR, so I'll say for a lot of you that aren't from the United States, think about the business model of Formula One. Take that business model and apply it to rocket-powered airplanes flying in a three-dimensional track in the sky. As a Navy pilot, we used to fly with a helmet-mounted virtual display where a lot of your information is presented in your helmet visor. Well, you can take that same technology and you can put a racetrack in the sky in your helmet-mounted virtual display. So you're flying through this racetrack in the sky. I thought that was really cool. One person's flying through circles, another person's flying through squares, another person's flying through pentagons, whatever shape you want. It could be the McDonald's arches if you want to get an endorsement, that kind of deal. So, so the idea was if it's presented in your helmet-mounted virtual display, and it can also be presented on TV using the same technology that we use with, if you watch baseball, you throw the baseball through that little square that's presented on the screen. Maybe if you watch American football, you see the yellow line on the screen for the first down marker. Like, you can take those technologies, you can present what I see in a helmet-mounted virtual display, you can present on television so everybody can see what we call the racetrack in the sky. Now, the rockets themselves there's no modulation of throttle. They're either on or they're off, which presents a lot of challenges for the pilot. But more importantly, it's really fun for the spectator, because the spectator never knows who's winning or losing because you don't know how much fuel is remaining with each one of the racers. And it's really a game of fuel management when your rocket is either on or off. So there's a lot of lane change, or not a lane change, but a lot of lead changes, that kind of thing. And you can create a digital image of what the rocket this was back in 2002, 2003. Like all these technologies now, it'd be easy. Compile them, put them together, go win in the market. But back then, this was all still really new. And one of the things we wanted to do was, if you can take all of the data from the inertial navigation system on board the aircraft, not a spacecraft, an aircraft with a rocket propellant, you take all that data off board, your inertial navigation knows latitude, longitude, altitude, yaw, pitch, roll, trajectory, velocity. You take all that data, you teleport it off board, you put it into some kind of modeling system, and you can create a digital image of what's happening in the race real time as the race is happening. And this gives you the opportunity to do a couple of things. Number one, you can time divide your sponsorships. So instead of NASCAR or Formula One having lots of stickers on one car, you can actually change your sponsor on the entire vehicle during the course of the race, which gives the sponsors a lot more value because they can actually see, the sponsorship. And you can, for example, if you got Kellogg's as a sponsor, you could be Special K in one frame and Frosted Flakes in the next frame and Rice Krispies in the next frame. So you can change your sponsorship real time during the race, which I thought was cool. The other thing is, once you create that live and virtual construct, young people on the other side of the planet, here we are at International Space University, young people on the other side of the planet can race against you real time as you're racing in the race, even though they're doing it in a video game and you're doing it so they can't die, but you can. It's not really fair. But you can create the model so that they can race against you real time in the race. And so the idea was the business model of Formula One, ticket sales, merchandising, television rights, corporate sponsors, video gaming. And again, the whole purpose being to advance rocket science and space technology apart from the whimsical budgets of politicians. That was the idea. And as a Navy pilot, this was really attractive to me. So I invested some money in it, lost it all, and it went defunct. So there's that. So don't want to go into that story. But I will tell you that that really kind of whet my appetite for a whole lot of things that came next. I ran for the U.S. House of Representatives from Tulsa, Oklahoma. I served on the Armed Services Committee, Subcommittee on Strategic Forces. So there, you're responsible for all of our national security space capabilities, oversight of those capabilities. Wow, that was eye-opening, I'll say that to say the least. And then I was also on the Science Committee in the House. The Science Committee has a number of subcommittees. One of the subcommittees is a subcommittee on space, which oversees NASA. Another subcommittee is a subcommittee on the environment, which oversees NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So in the United States, think about the Weather Service. So a lot of people don't realize about 40% of NOAA's budget is, in fact, space-related activities. So here I was in the House of Representatives, serving on these committees, dealing a lot with space issues. And I got to the point where I drafted a very comprehensive space reform bill called the American Space Renaissance Act. And that led to me being appointed ultimately to be the NASA administrator, which I never would have anticipated. When I was sitting in classrooms on this university, I never would have anticipated being one day at the helm of NASA, which I had the opportunity to be, and it was amazing, and I'm grateful for those opportunities. So I want to talk today about the diplomatic capabilities of NASA, the international capabilities of NASA, and of course we're going to open it up to questions. I want to hear your perspectives, your thoughts, and of course if you have questions, I'm happy to entertain those as well. So think about your questions. Nothing is off the table. If I don't want to answer, I'll just say I'm not answering. If it's a really tough question, I'll go to David Alexander, who runs the Space Institute here at Rice University. You guys all know David Alexander at this point, I presume? Well, you should. He's the tall, bald guy in the back. Beautiful bald guy, I should say. Okay. So when you think about NASA, and let's just start about, we talk about, here in the United States, we talk about the dime theory of national power. So dime theory, so we divide national power up into certain elements. Diplomatic power, and every nation, of course, has diplomacy. The United States is no different. There's information power. A lot of people think of information power as being intelligence, and I think that's certainly a big chunk of it, but I think a lot of it is also just demonstration to the world of technological prowess. So in that information power, you think about what the Apollo program was. You had two great powers in competition with each other in going back to the 1950s and 1960s, and this was the Soviet Union and the United States of America in this great power competition, and you've got two nations that are trying to prove that their economic and political systems are superior to the other, and in that process, they're competing on technology. And a demonstration of that technology was the moon program. And when John F. Kennedy came here to Rice University and gave his speech, he was trying to marshal the nation to say, we, the United States of America, we can marshal all the capabilities of this country to defeat the Soviet Union in something that was extraordinarily challenging, like landing on the moon, and I can get to that in a second. So diplomatic power, information power. Then there's the M, which is military power. That is not what NASA does. But I will say there's technology that overlaps. When you're talking about access to space, commercial companies are providing access to space now for both the military and for NASA, and for a whole host of commercial capabilities. So there's a lot of technological overlap there. But there's military power where NASA intentionally does not play. And that goes back even before John F. Kennedy came to Rice and gave his speech. When NASA was created in 1958, President Eisenhower wanted NASA to be a tool of diplomacy, not a tool of war. And Congress at the time was pushing hard for NASA to be put inside the Department of the Army. And Eisenhower said, no, we're not going to continue to build the military-industrial complex coming off of World War II. He didn't want that. He wanted to make sure that NASA was used for exploration and diplomacy and science and discovery and learning, not being part of the military apparatus. And that was intentional. So that's the M in DIME, and then the E in DIME is economic power. And there's a lot happening in space now where nations are starting to understand really the value of space from a microgravity perspective, but there's a lot of other things people don't realize. I know this audience does because you're here, but a lot of people don't realize how dependent we are on space for our everyday lives. And that's where that economic power comes from. So that's the DIME theory of national power. Every nation uses each one of those elements in various ways, whether or not they say it, that way or not. That's what everybody is working towards. And so that D in DIME is really where NASA plays the best, because it is a tool of diplomacy for this nation, and it was designed that way intentionally by President Eisenhower. So when we think about that tool of diplomacy, NASA has, of course, made massive investments into the International Space Station. And the International Space Station is operated by 15 different countries. And that's been a really great tool of diplomacy for now, 24 years, which is great to see. And even before that, that's how long it's been flying, but even before that, under development. And in that international kind of collaboration, we think about countries working together that historically were not working together. We think about going back in time. Even before the International Space Station, we had the Apollo-Soyuz program. That was the United States and the Soviet Union working together to do science and exploration and discovery and prove capability. And even before that, you had the Apollo-Soyuz program. Again, that was in the height of the Cold War. You've got the Soviet Union, United States, trying to work together to have a channel of communication and open dialogue, a way for experts to work together collaboratively at a time of great tension between our countries. I think that is the promise of space. That is the promise of International Space University. That is what I hope everybody in this room takes away. That yes, there always will be conflict and friction throughout the world. But there are areas where even in the midst of conflict and friction, countries that don't see eye to eye can work together. And it has worked in the history of this country and the history of the world, and it can work in the future. And I'm really hopeful that we can take the lessons of the past and apply them to the future. What works, what doesn't work, how do we work together, and how do we avoid conflict? Because ultimately that's what we should all be striving to achieve. So, and that's, again, I really believe that is the promise of space. So the International Space Station is built on the legacy of Apollo-Soyuz and the Shuttle Mir program. By the way, when I was the head of NASA, of course, we had to do a lot of work with Russia. And when I would say the Apollo-Soyuz program, some of them would correct me and say, well, you mean the Soyuz Apollo program. Sure. Yes, that's good. Let's call it that. But you get my point. My point is nations working together that don't have a history of working together, trying to figure out how we can collaborate on things that are really good for humanity and stunning for the world to see. And again, I think that's where space plays. So that's the International Space Station. We've had experiments on the International Space Station from 103 different countries. That's a lot of countries that most of them don't have a space program, but when it comes to science and exploration, they want to get involved and they want to participate, and of course NASA stands ready to bring them on board and help them help themselves get the knowledge and information they're looking for. So I think, that's, promising. We think about how many astronauts have been to the International Space Station. I don't know what the number is now, but I know it's been maybe 18 or 19 different countries have had astronauts on the International Space Station. And now, with commercial space flight, not just the International Space Station, but commercial space flight, There's going to be lots of people going to space from countries all over the world. So I think that's very promising as well. When we think about NASA all the time, and we've got planetary science, earth science, astrophysics, heliophysics. We've got all these different parts of NASA doing different things, divisions, mission directorates. And when we think of all those different programs, NASA has over 700 active agreements with countries around the world. That's a pretty impressive capability of diplomacy in itself. 700 agreements, and that was back when I was there. There might be more now. So all that I think is a very positive development. But that's that D in DIME, that tool of diplomacy. When I think about the I in DIME, which is information, when I think about that I in DIME, again, everybody thinks about intelligence, and yes, there are assets in space that are collecting, remote sensing, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, all of that exists, and that's a piece of that I in DIME. I would also say, going back to the Apollo program, there was a day the United States of America was losing in the space race really bad. We, the United States, we were not the first to orbit. The Soviet Union was. We were not the first to put humans in orbit. The Soviet Union was. And I know this audience knows this history well because you're here. We were not the first, we weren't the first to space. We weren't the first to orbit. We weren't the first to put a human in orbit. And after Yuri Gagarin did his orbit mission and he came home safely, became a hero of the Soviet Union, it was about a couple weeks after that, we did our straight up and straight down mission with Alan Shepard, which was basically 116 miles straight up and right back down, and that was an orbit. It was a lot easier than going to orbit. And that's when John F. Kennedy said, I'm going to go to he came to the House of Representatives and gave a speech to a joint session of Congress, including the Senate, and he said, we're going to send somebody to the moon. We just went 116 miles up and down, and then in a couple of weeks, he's going to go give a speech and say, we're going to go 240,000 miles to the moon. We're going to land a person safely on the moon, and we're going to bring that person safely back to Earth. And Congress is looking at him saying, you're nuts. This is crazy. But he wanted to put a marker out there that said, look, we can do great things too, and we're going to do what it takes to make that happen. At the time, it wasn't too long after that, the program was very unpopular. Why was it so unpopular? We were spending, as a nation, the United States, we were spending about 4.5%, almost 5% of our federal budget every year to land somebody on the moon. That's a big chunk of our national treasure to land somebody on the moon, yet we were doing it. That's because we were trying to push forward on that I in DIME. This was great power competition. Interestingly, not only was it not popular because it was costing so much money, and most people didn't believe it was technologically achievable. They didn't think it would ever happen. And then in 1967, we had the Apollo 1 failure, where we had Ed White and Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee die. These were three of the most famous people in America. These were the people that were going to go to the moon on the cover of magazines. And they were in a fire and they died. And this was 1967. And Congress and a whole bunch of other people were saying, we need to cancel this program. It's not going to be achieved, and we're spending way too much money. Then we had the Apollo 6 mission. So it didn't get canceled. It continued to go forward. We get to Apollo 6, and it's really the first test flight of a Saturn V rocket, the biggest, most powerful rocket ever built in human history. It's going to take, in the future, it's going to take Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the moon in 1969. But in April of 1968, we launched this rocket, and it pogoed so bad, the vibrations were so terrible, that parts of the rocket fell off. Embarrassing. And by the way, in the United States, when we launch something, we don't hide it. Everybody's there. The press is there, the media is there, the whole world is watching as parts of the rocket on Apollo 6 fall off and we see this pogo. Then the second stage has 5 engines. 2 of them don't ignite. Again, the whole world can see that. And because 2 of them don't ignite, the command and service module never gets to the velocity necessary. By the way, the command and service module has 1 engine. It has to reignite. If you're going to the moon, it has to reignite over and over and over again, dozens of times. You know, to do your translunar injection, to correct your course on the way to the moon, to do your retro burn, to slow down and let the moon's gravity capture you. This 1 engine is a workhorse. It has to work if you're going to the moon. Well, on Apollo 6, they couldn't get it to reignite even once. Forget about dozens of times. You can't get it to reignite even. So now you've got the first stage pogoed, parts fell off. Second stage, 2 of the 5 engines don't even ignite. The third stage, the command and service module, that engine won't reignite even once. And then because of all these failures, the heat shield never got to the velocity necessary to test the entry, descent, and landing coming back at 35,000 miles per hour. Apollo 6, terrible failure. Again, people are like, what are we doing here? We need to stop this program. The next day, intelligence came into the United States, and it said that there was real intelligence that said the Soviet Union will be in orbit around the moon by the end of the year. Uh-oh. The United States better get with it. Because if they're going to be in orbit around the moon before we're in orbit around the moon, that's going to demonstrate that once again, they beat us to space, they beat us to orbit, they beat us with humans in orbit, now they're going to beat us to the moon. So that intelligence comes in, and the United States says, okay, well, we're going to redouble our efforts. And NASA did. And we continued to plow American treasure into this thing. I mean, tons of money. Going forward, and by the way, it was in August of 1968 when the decision was made that by the end of 1968, we're going to put our own humans around the moon. The intelligence, remember, from the Soviet Union was they're going to be in orbit around the moon by the end of 1968. Not on the moon, but around the moon. They're going to go into lunar orbit. That was the intelligence. And so we needed to be in lunar orbit. The problem is we don't have a lunar module, which is the lifeboat. I know there's some people maybe in the audience that were around for Apollo 13. The rest of us watched the movie Apollo 13. Anybody here seen the movie Apollo 13? You know the story of Apollo 13? This audience knows the story, right? So on Apollo 13, that lifeboat was, the command and service module had massive problems. The lifeboat was the lunar module. Well, here we are at the end of 1968, and there isn't a lunar module yet. It's not ready. And remember, on Apollo 6, that single engine that's supposed to reignite over and over again wouldn't reignite even once. This was all in the same year. So in April, we had the failure. In August, we make the decision that we're going to get rid of the human landing system, and instead we're going to go with the command and service module only with that single engine, that if it doesn't work, our astronauts are going to be trapped at the moon for the rest of their lives, which is only going to be a couple of days. This was crazy. And by the way, the intelligence, the information that NASA headquarters was getting was, the optimum Earth-Moon alignment to make this journey to the moon in 1968, the optimum alignment is on Christmas Eve. Well, in the United States of America, Christmas Eve is critically important to pretty much everybody. So to the extent that this mission fails, the whole country is going to be watching the failure on Christmas Eve. It would wreck Christmas for the whole country. I know it sounds funny, but this was a big deal. And yet NASA and the president still said, go do it. We've got to get ahead. We're going to make this happen. I'm saying all of this stuff to let you know how important the I in DIME was in the 1960s, that information power. And so we made it happen. And in 1968, December 24th, our astronauts, by the way, when this decision was made in August, we think about the communication networks necessary to communicate with astronauts going to the moon. We think about how we're going to pick the astronauts up when they land in the ocean. All of these things had not been fully thought through at this point. We in fact, didn't know who the crew was going to be because, we just hadn't selected them yet. And yet we had to accelerate because our biggest competitor on the planet at the time was going to be in orbit around the moon. So all of these decisions got made. People said it was nuts. By the way, before the launch, the person who was the head of, I think, the Johnson Space Center, was on record saying 50-50 chance they come home alive, which, by the way, might have been generous. And by the way, I want to be really clear. Folks at NASA will tell me that's not true. Some people might. But that was recorded. I think Jim Lovell made that comment or something. Either way, at the end of the day, and Jim Lovell was on Apollo 8. So December 24th, 1968, our astronauts are in orbit around the moon. Now, they're not going to land because they don't have a human lander with them, but that single engine, Christmas Eve, 1968, they're going to communicate with the whole world when they key that mic and talk, right? The whole world's watching. In fact, the data was that 1 out of 4 people on the planet either heard or saw that live broadcast on December 24th, 1968, live. 1 in 4 people on the planet. December 24th, 1968. And NASA's guidance to those astronauts was, say something profound. Because everybody's going to be watching. And on the way to the moon, when they were figuring out what they were going to say, it was actually before they started heading towards them. It was when they were on deck. They talked about what they were going to say, and the decision was, we're going to say something that unites the world. And they read from the book of Genesis, Genesis 1:1 through Genesis 1:10, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And they read that from the book of Genesis on Christmas Eve, 1968. And at the time, there was people around the country that didn't have religious freedom. And they were communicating to those people around the country that in the United States of America, our government didn't tell us what to say. We get to say whatever we want, and this is what we wanted to communicate to you. And I think that had a profound impact on a lot of people. Whether it was intended or not, that I and dime got a lot of attention in those days. And the whole world could see and hear what the United States was achieving. Now, it wasn't too long after that, in July of 1969, when our astronauts actually landed on the moon. And then it wasn't 1 out of 4 people on the planet, it was everybody. Everybody on the planet either heard or saw it. If you didn't hear it live, you saw it later. I wasn't even born yet I watched it in kindergarten in black and white. So that was obviously a big deal. And here's the interesting thing. When we think about the I and dime, you fast forward about 13 years, there was another president of the United States, Ronald Reagan, who created what was called the Strategic Defense Initiative. Remember, we're still in this great power competition. And it's the United States and the Soviet Union, and now instead of just going to the moon, each country is building stockpiles of nuclear weapons and missiles to deliver them, and they're intercontinental ballistic missiles. And there's got to be a way that we don't all just destroy each other. So Ronald Reagan said, we're going to do the Strategic Defense Initiative. People called it the Star Wars program to make fun of it. Ronald Reagan yeah, that's Star Wars. We like Star Wars. So they created this process by which to destroy weapons that are heading our direction in flight. And the reality was, again, people were saying, it's too expensive, it's not technologically achievable, this can't work, why are we doing this? Spending huge amounts of money on this program. But countries around the globe believed it was possible. Why did countries around the globe believe it was possible? Because they saw, 13 years prior, they saw a total of 6 crews, 12 people, walk on the surface of the moon from the United States of America. My point is this. How a nation presents itself with technological supremacy actually has huge implications for international policy. Now, we can either continue to have this great power competition and let that drive to technological achievement, which is it's been done before and we can keep doing it, or we can collaborate and do things that are even more stunning than any country could do on their own. And that's the promise of exploration, science, and discovery. That's the promise that we had from Eisenhower, who said we don't want this to be part of the defense industrial complex. That's the promise of the International Space Station, the Apollo-Soyuz program, and the Shuttle Mir program. That's the promise that I think we all should be striving to achieve, because rather than building weapons and pointing them at each other and then trying to figure out how we're going to knock those weapons out of the sky, let's figure out how are we going to send humans to Mars. Let's figure out how are we going to have a sustainable presence on the surface of the moon. Let's do things collaboratively in space that enable all of humanity to be proud of who we are and what we're trying to achieve. I think that's the promise of space. Anyway, that's more than you ever wanted me to talk about on the I and DIME. I think the next area is the E. And the military piece, it's not where NASA plays. There's a lot to be said there. We should just know that we're dependent on space, whether it's communications, navigation, how we produce food, how we produce energy, how we do disaster relief, national security, how we predict weather, how we understand climate, the timing signal from GPS. Everybody knows the value of all these things and how they're critically important to all the infrastructure all around the globe. And not just GPS, but GLONASS and BEDAO and all these different timing and navigation capabilities. All of these things are, I think, we have to contemplate that if nations are dependent on these capabilities and they are part of our critical infrastructure, then they're going to be targeted in a time of great power conflict. And if they're going to be targeted, they also have to be defended. And if they're going to be defended, we have to figure out how to build resilient architectures and structures. And that's really what the M in DIME is focused on these days. The E in DIME is far more fun to think about, and that is that we are right now learning, and I just talked about a whole lot of those things, navigation, producing food, energy, communication, all that stuff. But I think one thing that's super exciting right now is the idea that microgravity holds tremendous promise for things like creating new pharmaceutical crystals that are going to transform how we treat disease. Everything from cancer to you name it. We're going to be able to create new and different pharmaceutical crystals that are going to save lives here on Earth. We think about the ability to print human organs in 3D, to take human cells. We can take David Alexander's cells. We can take them. We can put them into. We can create stem cells out of David Alexander's skin cells. Yes. We're going to create him a new scalp, one with follicles. But we can take those cells, and then we can start, because of the promise of microgravity, we can start 3D printing in 3 dimensions, which, by the way, that would be 3D printing, right? But the overwhelming force in microgravity is surface tension, which means whatever you print, whatever shape it takes, that's the shape that it holds, and then you can cure it and you can bring it back. We just created some heart tissue in space using this process. We created a meniscus in space. Anybody here need a meniscus? I need a meniscus. I need a couple of them. So we can do these things now. Now, we've proven that they can be done. The question is, can we commercialize them? Can we capitalize them? Can we get private capital to put money in? Can we then turn those into marketable capabilities that will transform how we do regenerative medicine? It's 3D printing. It's the growth of human tissue as well. It's brand new materials. One thing that I've talked about a lot in my time as a NASA administrator is macular degeneration. We can create artificial retinas for the human eye so people who are going to go blind don't have to go blind anymore. That's the promise of microgravity, these new materials that we can create. So there's a lot. And by the way, I don't even know what they all are, and neither does anybody else. What we do know is that atoms and molecules, they organize and do things differently in space that enable all of these new and different technologies. And we've got to make sure that we're using space for those purposes. I think that's a really exciting piece of the E and DIME, that we all need to be thinking about as we go forward. So that's the dime theory of national power. Countries around the globe are applying it to how they're going to, achieve greatness in their own capabilities, and I'm excited about it, and I hope you are too. And I've got a lot more time, and you guys are open to ask me questions. So. How do you guys usually do this? Do you have a mic or? Okay.
Hello, thank you. My name is James Fettis. I'm from Australia. Thank you so much for your time and generosity tonight. It's been really insightful. I wanted to talk about, I suppose, the Moon to Mars architecture. So Artemis and especially Gateway are positioned for international and commercial contributions, but both ultimately are US-led. We're seeing other space powers obviously sort of cut their own path to the moon. You mentioned earlier that the Apollo program, was pushing 5% of the US federal budget. And while that budget has grown a lot in the past decades, the cost of a crewed Mars mission would be orders of magnitude greater than probably anything we've attempted before. So my question is a crewed Mars mission only feasible as an international effort with equal partners, or do you think that national and international posturing will lead an attempt to specifically land an American or a Chinese person or someone else on Mars first?
I could give a whole lecture on all of this. I'll try to get right to the heart of your question. The United States of America definitely wants to get to Mars. The moon is the first step in that process. A lot of people have said, well, why don't we just go straight to Mars? The reality is, if you can't fly to the moon, you're probably not going to be able to get to Mars, just keeping it real. So when I hear politicians say, well, we're going to go to Mars and we're going to skip the moon, what I hear is, we're going to do neither. And it creates great controversy. When I got to the U.S. House of Representatives, I'm going way too much here, but when I went to the U.S. House of Representatives, I was on the Science Committee, and it was stunning to me how all of the Republicans wanted to go to the moon and all the Democrats wanted to go to Mars. It was the dumbest thing I've ever seen. How in the world do we get to this place where this is politically divisive? I can go through that process, how it got there, but it was dumb. And so when I went to NASA, we got to break this down. It's not going to be moon or Mars. It's going to be moon to Mars. It's going to be both, and we're not going to have these divisions that are built on artificial things that aren't real. But it was also, we've got to have international partners with us. We're not going to do it Republican only, I can tell you that. We're certainly not going to do it America only. It's going to require all of us together to achieve these things. Because as you said, it is terribly expensive. We're also going to need private companies where most of the innovation is around the globe, but especially here in the United States, the innovation isn't coming from career government employees. The innovation is coming from entrepreneurs that have great ideas that are going out and selling those ideas, capitalizing them, and then delivering on products. Those are the types of things that are going to drive down the cost and increase the access to space, as we've already seen with SpaceX and a whole host of others now. But that's going to happen not just with low Earth orbit. That's going to happen with cislunar orbit. It's going to happen with the moon, and it's going to happen with Mars. People years ago said there's no way any commercial companies are going to be delivering assets to space. Now the US government has to buy commercial because it's so much less expensive than the government solution. So things are going to continue changing. It's going to be positive. The costs are going to come down. Capabilities are going to go up. And yes, I do believe we will get to Mars. It will be, in the United States, bipartisan, and it will be with a coalition of international partners. So I think all of that, there's more. Well, help me, remind me some of your thoughts in there that I want to hit.
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head. So one of our team projects is...
For the lecturing.
Oh, yeah. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I asked because one of our team projects is looking at capabilities for Gateway to enable that Moon to Mars architecture. And I've just been particularly thinking about how, I guess, kind of the old world format of national posturing for being the first surely is unworkable when you're looking, much further into the future at such logistical and cost.
Yeah, so I agree with you 100%. Now let me tell you, my role as the NASA administrator, and this was hard. There's so much it was hard. When I first started at NASA, I was meeting with the heads of space agencies from around the world, including Australia, which stood up a brand new space agency when I was at NASA. I will tell you, the hard part was those heads of space agencies don't control budgets. They receive budgets, and those budgets are really low. And Australia is not unlike so many other countries in the world. You create a space agency, you give it $80 million, and everybody's declaring victory. Well, that gets you one rocket to low Earth orbit. We got to do more. And I love Australia. We're thrilled they started a program. And my goal was, I don't want to meet with the head of the space agency. I want to meet with the finance minister, because those are the people that are going to be able to give the Australian Space Agency more money. And I will tell you, the United States has been woefully inadequate at meeting with the United States has not done its job going around the globe, talking to the financial supporters of these programs and convincing them to put more money into their space programs. I do believe that's the part that the United States needs to lead on, but we also need to see more money coming in from these other countries. Now, when it comes to the International Space Station, and this is kind of the model that currently exists, and I was stunned to learn this when I was on the Science Committee in the House of Representatives. We've got 15 countries that operate the International Space Station. 74% of the International Space Station's budget comes from one country. It's the United States. The vast preponderance of the resources are being paid for from the American taxpayer. What's interesting is NASA's budget, when I left NASA, it was around $25 billion. When I started at NASA, it was at 19. So we got it to go up, and I had to lobby hard at the Office of Management and Budget, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the National Space Council, the Vice President's Office, the President's Office. As the head of NASA, I was fighting within my own government, my own, quite frankly, administration, to get the resources necessary to achieve the outcomes that I heard the President say when he was giving speeches. If we're going to do these things, if we're going to go to the moon, we've got to have more money. And so I would go make those fights. Now, once you have the fight within your own administration, then you've got to get members of Congress on both sides of the aisle to see the vision. So I was doing town halls with Speaker Pelosi in San Francisco, trying to build the consensus within our own country. Remember, programs start and stop when you have changes of administration. The thing I was asked earlier, what was the thing I was most proud of at NASA? It's the fact that when we went from one administration to the next, the Artemis program continued. The Commercial Lunar Payload Services program continued. Commercial LEO destinations continued. Nothing got canceled. Why? Because we were constantly fighting to build consensus after fighting with our own administration to get the budget request necessary. Where I should have and tried to do more, and I did everything I could with the amount of time that I had, but we ran into COVID and a whole host of other things. You got to travel around the globe, and you got to, just as I'm fighting for resources from my own government, I've got to be fighting for resources from other governments that are part of this coalition. And I'll give you an example. For example, the European Space Agency. You add up all the countries that are part of the European Space Agency, and their GDP is about the same as the United States of America. And yet, the European Space Agency budget, at the time I was the NASA administrator, was between $4 and $5 billion annually. NASA's budget is $25 billion annually, and I'm fighting for more. And I'm asking my European counterparts, can you guys get us more resources, because we got to get to the moon? And by the way, there's this Mars thing. We got to get this done too. And it takes resources, and the more we get now, the less it's going to cost in the future. Let's go make this happen. And so I quit meeting with I didn't quit meeting with them. I kept meeting with the head of agencies, but I also made sure that they understood my goal is to meet with their finance minister, their minister of science, whoever controls the budget for their agency. That's who I was meeting with. I will tell you, the United States of America takes the lead because of how much we spend and invest in the projects. It's not necessarily because we want to be in the lead. It's because when we go get a new partner, the partner says, what do you want us to do? And I've got ideas for you. Let's talk about what your capabilities are, and let's figure out how you can plug into the Artemis program. If you want to be a part of the Artemis program, we want you in. And that was true for every country on the globe, period. We want everybody on the globe involved in the Artemis program. Now, that is not a realistic outcome, and I understand that, but it's what we fought for. We didn't achieve it, competitors. We want competitors in there too, and we worked hard to achieve that. But I will tell you, the United States takes the lead because we're putting in a preponderance of the assets, and I'm not just talking about in an absolute form. I'm talking proportional to, what our GDP is, and so we've got to see a lot of other countries step up. And I get it. We're going to take the lead because we do have a history and a legacy here. We want to be. We're not afraid of the lead. We'll be in the lead, but we need to have others step up too. Yeah, more
Thank
than you
you.
wanted to know.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for the inspiring lecture. My name is Alessandro, and I have a question. I want to keep it a little more personal as I'm interested in your experience at the agency. So being very vocal about it over the years as an administrator, I want to ask you if you could walk us through a little bit the NASA's commercial partnership with SpaceX as you work to return humans launch capability to NASA and to the States in particular. And with that, I'm interested about what NASA learned and what things potentially changed in the agency's approach now that we're moving towards Artemis and returning humans to the moon. Thank you.
That's good. Relationship with SpaceX, it's interesting. I want to be clear. I love SpaceX. They've done amazing things, not just for our country, but for the world. Going back to the previous question, tying it in here, the first time I sat down one-on-one with Elon Musk, I was a member of Congress, and I was in Hawthorne, California. And in this conversation, I shared with him, I'm all in on commercial, and I was meeting with him because I was a leading advocate for commercial space in the House of Representatives. And I told him I'm all in for commercial, but we've got to figure out how do we do partnerships with international. And Elon will tell you this as much as he would tell it to me. And I thought it was great to hear. I needed to hear it from him. He said the only thing worse than a bureaucratic government is lots of bureaucratic governments. And he's absolutely right. And I felt that firsthand when I went from Congress to NASA. It was very clear. It's a problem. Which is why having the ability to get out from under the bureaucratic governments to achieve the outcomes should be the goal. It's why you guys heard my story on the Rocket Racing League at the beginning of this. That was my intent as well. And I was just a passive investor. I loved the idea. I made the investment. I lost the money. There you go. But at the end of the day, I think, again, the key is where is the innovation going to come from? And what are the motivations of government employees to not only keep their jobs, but to advance in the ranks? The motivation is to not make mistakes. And if you look at how SpaceX does business, they not only have failure, they put their failure all over the internet, and they show the world, hey, this rocket just blew up, here's why, and then they do it again the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and eventually they figure it out, and they're stunning the world, not only by docking a cargo Dragon to the International Space Station, but then bringing those rockets home, landing them on barges in the ocean, then doing a heavy launch and bringing two home in formation, landing them simultaneously. All of these stunning things are not because a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. was trying to save their job. They happened because somebody was willing to have an idea and say, if they're not doing it, I am. And they made these stunning achievements. Now, for every Elon Musk, there's 100 people that fail. And that's probably a generous number. It's probably a lot more than that. So the key is ultimately understanding what the technologies are that need to advance in order to achieve the outcomes we want to achieve, and then how to pick the winners in that. Who are the minds that can actually achieve the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? But a lot of that is not going to be done by government. It's going to be done in the private sector. And what the government has to do is the government has to say, if we're going to have a program, and I said this over and over again at NASA, if we're going to have a program, we want to buy it as a service, not own it and operate it. I will tell you that is not a popular thing to say inside the agency, and there's NASA people here. We want to buy it as a service. We don't want to own it and operate it. But to the extent that we buy it as a service, we need multiple providers that are competing against each other on cost and innovation. That's a key element to having a successful commercial program. What you can't say is you can't say, well, we're going to have the government fund a commercial company and we're going to buy a service from that commercial. That's just exchanging a government monopoly for a commercial monopoly that the government is dependent on. That's not the right approach. You have to have multiple commercial providers that are competing against each other, cost and innovation, and then they need to go get customers that are not NASA. In fact, they need to get customers that are not the government. Then you have a real commercial opportunity where the government can buy things at a much lesser rate, and you're sharing the cost with commercial and international partners as well. I think the relationship has been fantastic from our perspective. NASA has been made better. NASA has seen how SpaceX does business and adjusted. I will also tell you that SpaceX has seen how NASA does business and adjusted correctly the other way. There was a time when there was great tension between, and I don't know if you guys follow Twitter, but not too long ago I sent a pretty nasty tweet. I don't want to replay all that, but we were having some real challenges. And I think all this has been made public. I mean, I did a town hall with Elon Musk on this issue. After I sent the nasty tweet, we came together at a 4-hour meeting, and we came to an agreement. But when we left the meeting, while it was tense to begin with, it was all good in the end. But the idea was, I got the president saying we need to launch American astronauts on American rockets from American soil, and I worked hard with a little handshake here. Oh, good. So to be clear, I worked really hard to get that put into the State of the Union address. What I didn't know is that the president would put in there, we're going to launch American astronauts on American rockets from American soil by the end of the year. Like, that changes the dynamic a lot. And yet, that's where we were. So he said by the end of the year, and in April of 2019, we had this explosion of a capsule because, nitrogen tetroxide came in contact with titanium at high pressure and velocity, and it created an explosion, which we should have foreseen and we should have adjusted ahead of time. And so my NASA engineers were telling me at the time, we need to exchange all of the titanium for Inconel. We'll pay a weight penalty, but at the end of the day, there will be no explosions like this. Okay, let's go make that happen. Well, there was a disagreement between the NASA engineers and the SpaceX engineers, and so we were having that argument. On the other hand, we were learning about asymmetric loading on the parachutes. When the parachute deployed, there would be, any one of the risers could end up having the entire weight of the vehicle on that one riser, and then it would snap. And if one snaps, then they all start snapping, and the modeling on this was disastrous. So we had a couple of options. We could either redesign the parachute, which would add a lot of time and a lot of weight, or it would add a lot of time and a lot of money, which, by the way, I've got to do this by the end of the year, remember. So we can't do that. So we need to change the material, which, again, we're going to pay a weight penalty, but then the asymmetric loading problem has enough margin where we're going to be just fine, even if there is asymmetric loading. Again, our engineers at NASA disagreed with their engineers at SpaceX, and so we had these debates. And in the meantime, SpaceX is doing things like Starship that NASA had put no money into, and so I got frustrated. I sent a nasty tweet, and then we came together and agreed on how we're going to move forward together to achieve the outcome. So the point is, there has been tension, and when we buy commercial services, the government loses control. We have got to figure out how to balance that correctly. In some cases, it's been a good balance. In other cases, it hasn't. But in this particular case, I think it's because the leaders were able to get together and come to a consensus on how to move forward. That's not always the case. And when NASA is putting its astronauts on a vehicle, You know, we've got to make sure that we're doing right by them, which is why when I went into that meeting, I had my astronauts with me. And they're kind of, you know, straddling both sides because they're all in on SpaceX and they're all in on NASA, and we're trying to figure it out. But this is not unlike any other engineering situation in general. There will always be tension, and there will always be hard decisions that have to be made. And in this particular case, you had a government and a contractor working it out. So I think it's good. And I will tell you, I think that was very healthy. I think it was very healthy. It would have been more unhealthy if there wasn't a conflict. So these kind of things I think are normal. But I will tell you, in general, the way these relationships have to go, if you're going to have commercial, you've got to have multiple providers that are competing on cost and innovation, and those providers have to get customers that are not the US government. And if you do that, you win. So there you go.
Hi, thank you very much for having this conversation with us. My name is Vittorio. I come from Italy. Actually, I believe you're also answering to what will be my question now, but I want to pose it anyway.
Okay.
Because after the end of the shuttle program here in US, there was a big issue with the launching capability. And I feel right now at the moment in Europe, we have the same issue. We are not able to launch anything into space. And since the involvement of companies, private companies in the sector of space launching, here in US, things are going better. I wanted to know, in your experience, what was done by NASA and by the US administration in general to make it possible, and how we can do the same thing in Europe to make it possible for us as well.
I want to be clear. I don't know that we've got our own history of problems, and I'll get to some of those. But I'll give you some examples right now. We got the Apollo program was awesome. And we in America, we think back very nostalgically on the awesomeness of Apollo, and I would imagine the rest of the world does as well. The challenge with Apollo is that it ended. A new president comes in, cancels the program, and we've got nothing until we have Space Shuttle 8 years later. We had a period of 8 years there where we had nothing. Then we had, in the middle of the shuttle program, we put all of our launches on the shuttle, including commercial, civil, national security. Everything was dependent on the shuttle. And then in 1986, we had the Challenger accident. And all of a sudden, that comes to a screeching halt, and we're without space flight for a period of years. And by the way, that wasn't just bad for NASA. That was bad for the national security interests of the United States and all of our partners around the world, because we had no access to launch at all for a period of time. That's when we learned a lesson that said we're going to have diversity in our launch capabilities. We're not going to depend on just one system. Which, by the way, when we think about going forward, we think about the commercial resupply program. We've got SpaceX and Northrop Grumman that are resupplying the International Space Station. We can't have a day where we're not resupplying the ISS. We also, in commercial crew, we've got two providers, Boeing and SpaceX. Again, we can't have a day where we're not sending crew to the ISS. So we've got to have multiple providers, and we have to have dissimilar redundancy in those programs. And so what I will tell you is we had another stop where we had no access to space, and then shuttle comes back online. We have the Columbia accident, and the United States makes a decision that we're not going to use shuttles anymore. We're going to finish the International Space Station, and when it's over, we're going to go with different designs that have launch abort capability, because we don't want people not having the ability to get off board the vehicle. And so then we created the Commercial Crew Program. Well, after shuttle and before crew, we had a 9-year period where we had no access to space with humans. And the United States was dependent on Russia at the time. And I will tell you that partnership with Russia on the International Space Station, it worked. I will also tell you that we don't want to be dependent on anybody. We don't want to be dependent on the space shuttle. We need to have redundancy. We don't want to be dependent on the Soyuz. We need to have redundancy. And so we wanted to make sure that we had that. So we have had our own problems at various times without having access with humans to space. I think we've got that solved at this point fairly well. But I think it's also important, and I would love to see it happen, that Europe have its own commercial resupply program and its own commercial crew program. I'd love to see American astronauts fly on those vehicles, and I'd love to see European astronauts fly on our vehicles. I mean, that's the relationship that needs to continue if we're going to continue to do amazing things in space. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but your challenges in Europe right now are not unlike so many challenges we've had in the past, and quite frankly, challenges we've had up until recently when we got Boeing Starliner flying, which, again, we had SpaceX, which was delivering, but we've got to have that redundancy. So I think all those are important capabilities.
Hi, my name is Mihaela. I'm from Romania, and my question is more on the hypothetical side. And it has a little bit of roots in your knowledge of today's new space and geopolitical environment, technological development, and human aspirations. If you would be to travel in time and arrive on Earth 50 years from now, what and how that society would look like for you? How would you describe it to us?
50 years from now? Goodness. Well, we would have humans on Mars. We would have a permanent presence on the moon. I think we would have broad international coalitions that are putting together the concepts and ideas of achieving these end states. So I think those are all what the future holds. And if you look where we were 50 years ago, this collaborative kind of thing wasn't going on at all. Now we've got the International Space Station, the Artemis program, which is the largest, most robust international program in the history of human spaceflight. We've got 42 or 43 countries that have now signed on to the Artemis Accords, which is a great tool of diplomacy to compel all the nations that want, like, here's how that started, by the way. And I know this wasn't your question, but I'm going to go there anyway. Let's see. The Artemis Accord. So we were told we got to have a moon program. We're going to do that. We shaped the idea that we're going to have a moon program. So we decided to invite all the nations that wanted to participate in the moon program to have a meeting. And we did that first meeting, and like 26 countries showed up, which I wasn't anticipating. I figured we'd get half of the countries with a human spaceflight kind of program already to come to talk about a moon. We had 26 countries, and a lot of them didn't even have a space program, let alone a moon program. So when I saw that and how much enthusiasm there was for it, the question was, how do we use this program to compel good behavior? How do we use it to compel, and this was a problem of mine when I was in Congress, I was frustrated because people who had signed on to the Outer Space Treaty were not following the Outer Space Treaty. So how do we compel those good behaviors for sustainable space? And a lot of other, I think, important things. And so the idea was, if you want to be part of the Artemis program, we're all in. We want everybody to be part of the Artemis program. But if you want to be part of it, you have to adhere, you have to agree to the Artemis Accords. And if you agree to the Artemis Accords and you live by the Artemis Accords, you're going to be able to get access to the Artemis program. So it was a forcing function to compel countries that don't always do the right thing to do the right thing. That's how we got to the Artemis Accords. But I think the Artemis Accords are the beginning. 50 years from now, we're not going to have the Artemis Accords. We're going to have the Artemis Accords that exist today, plus a whole bunch of other stuff that makes space sustainable into the future. And if countries can agree to those things, we're going to have a great future. Everybody working together to go do stunning things in space and learn and discover more than we've ever done before. So I would hope that that's where we can get to. And I hope when that day comes, people look back at the Artemis Accords and they say, this is what enabled all of that to eventually happen. And I know that sounds grandiose and maybe a little self-indulgent, but I had to put it in there.
Hi, Jim. Paola from Italy.
Hi.
I would like to take back your story to one of the milestones that you mentioned before. So I was around for Apollo 13. I was around for Apollo 11. And
No way.
yes. But I remember a fantastic summer, 1975.
Okay, that's the summer I was born.
You see, that's exactly what I mean.
I like where this is going.
Apollo Soyuz,
Oh yes, yeah.
of course.
Okay, yeah.
That was a fantastic time for the entire world. As I said, I come from Italy, so yes, we were the third country to have a satellite up there, but at that time, we were so far from everything space. Nevertheless, it was a time when we felt that something was changing from the point of view of being one word, from not having that fight in mind between the USSR and the USA every day.
Yeah.
So it was really something
Refreshing.
that meant,
I can imagine, yeah.
yeah, that meant something.
Yeah.
I tell you that, okay, I can't explain you. It was something that really touched everyone.
Just so you know, the person who went through that and shook the hand from America, that shook the hand of the Russian,
Yeah.
that was a proud Oklahoman. Tom Stafford was his name, and he recently passed, but what an
Yeah.
amazing man.
So my question is very much, don't you think that we need really something like that these days and
Yes.
times?
100%. And that's why we created the Artemis program and the Artemis Accords, trying to bring everybody together. And I'm hopeful that just like in those days, while there might not be agreement today, in the future, there's on-ramps that would enable that type of relationship.
And do you think that NASA will have the same diplomatic strength and visibility image that it had?
I
at that
absolutely
time?
think so. I think that's the purpose of the agency, and if you talk to people there, they will tell you that's their goal too. I 100% think that that is the case.
Okay.
NASA is intentionally not part of the Department of Defense. NASA is a tool of diplomacy and science. And that's the way it needs to stay, and I will tell you, everybody at NASA understands that, and they want to see that continue.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, Jim. My name is Ritesh, and I'm from India. And first of all,
I love, is that an owl?
yes, it's a rice.
A rice owl?
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah.
You're my favorite guy here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
By the way, that's called pandering, and I like it.
No, but I would like to say something to you as well. You complimented me, so I really think that Rocket Racing League is cool. Super. cool.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. You and me both.
So my question is, what was your learning from the project, and if you were to start it again, what would you do differently? And why I ask you this question is based on my second question, that what would you advise to us to become successful spacepreneurs in future?
It's all great questions. On the Rocket Racing League, what I saw was a company that raised about $30 million, which seems like a lot of money, especially when you're a lieutenant junior grade in the United States Navy. It's a lot of money. But it's also a company that needed to raise about $300 million. And convincing the right people to make those investments never happened. And I saw that as a challenge that never got overcome. And because of that, there was tension at the leadership level. And rather than focusing on how to go raise the capital necessary to do it, they wanted to fight over who's in charge and who's in power and that kind of thing. So there was a very real human element to the whole thing that was easily overcomable with different personalities and maybe some contrition. And it never happened, and there was failure. I think it was eminently fundable. But the people that were in charge of it. So the key, in my view, for something like that, you can't just have the good idea and the right technology and the right technologists that can put it all together. You've got to have at the leadership somebody who understands for the long term what it takes. And you have to have investors, quite frankly, that are willing to let the leadership lead. And if you can put that together, I think we would all be enjoying rocket racing today. And instead, we don't. Now, I think there's a lot of room for it to come back maybe one day, and maybe you can lead that effort. Yeah, so I will be there as your biggest fan. So. Maybe you'll let me fly one of the rockets, which was ultimately my goal in the beginning. I was like, I want to fly one of those. How do I make that happen? Okay. Yes, I'm in.
Thank you for the lecture. Okay, yeah. Although there is some kind of ban between on relations between the U.S. and China, are there any collaboration on scientific missions like Moon or Asteroid Sample Return missions? If there is no any bilateral connection between the countries, do you think there should be such a cooperation on science missions?
There is currently some cooperation. It's limited, but it's really focused on the Earth Science Division of NASA, which I think is really important. It's understanding atmospherics, understanding ice, understanding how the Earth's climate is changing, those kind of things. And I think that's a good starting point. I will tell you politically, in the United States, there is a big barrier to overcome. It's called the Wolf Amendment, which this was put in an appropriation bill. I'm going to get into too much American politics here. But it was put into an appropriation bill because somebody got hacked. And they wanted to punish supposedly who the hacker was. And the idea was, and this is all in the media, I'm not telling you anything you shouldn't know. The idea was we're gonna prevent NASA from collaborating or cooperating with China. And that amendment got put in there, and that amendment has to be reapproved every year. And in the United States, it gets reapproved every year. And so what that does is it puts a chilling effect on the NASA administrator from being able to reach out to China, because those bilateral negotiations and discussions are blocked by law. I think it's a real problem. And in my view, that amendment needs to go away. Not because the NASA administrator needs to jump in and start collaborating or anything like that, but because if there are opportunities to collaborate that make sense on a bigger vision that ultimately can, avoid, here when I was at Rice, we read about the Peloponnesian War. Some of you are familiar with the Thucydides trap, that great powers that are equal in power, historically they always fight. I want to see us avoid the Thucydides trap. I'm a big advocate that space exploration is one thing you can put into agreements that will enable people to communicate and work together. And so I think the NASA administrator is in fact that person that can help those things move forward. And I think that people, for the wrong reasons, did the wrong thing here. I'm not saying they weren't well intended, I'm just saying they're not the right outcome. And I think it's time to revisit that. So I hope I answered your question, but I think right now, because of what's called the Wolf Amendment, we can't. But I think if that goes away, it opens the door to start a process where we can. There was a time when I was the NASA administrator when we were in this trade war with China. A lot of people remember that. It was devastating for a lot of industry in the United States and in China. I think we could have gotten to a better place quicker. While we're in the middle of this trade war, I'm getting interest from China to actually participate in the International Space Station. I'm not saying we should or shouldn't do that. What I'm saying is, right now we're blocked by law from doing that. And what you could do is you could put that on the table in a trade negotiation, because it doesn't cost us anything, maybe a little bit, but not much, and it would be tremendously valuable to China. I'm not saying that's a good idea, and right now I have no influence over that. But it seems to me that those are the kinds of ideas that we could open up and have dialogue and maybe get to a better position for both countries. And it's blocked by law, and I think that's incorrect.
Hi, I'm Ian. I'm German, I'm European. I'm proud of that.
Let me say this. I also want to see us launch European astronauts on European rockets from European soil.
Thank you. Thank you.
And by the way, before coming here, I had a meeting about exactly that. Europe is going to be eventually having their own commercial crew program.
I know.
And we're very excited about that.
So I'm a proud European, although I wish we had a little bit a bigger space budget. I think we all agree that the brightest and best should work to bring people back on the moon and to Mars. So how can we ensure that the brightest and best can actually work on it when they're not coming from those countries who invest the most money into it?
So by the way, I want to say this. When I was the NASA administrator, I had people from all over the world call and want an internship at NASA. And we can't just hand out jobs to people who aren't Americans because it's all American taxpayer money. So that it's a challenge for sure. What I would say is I think we need to get to a point where as we grow our budget for space and others grow their budgets for space, we ought to be able to exchange in many ways our personnel. I think it would be tremendously valuable. I think the relationship between the United States and Russia as it relates to the International Space Station has been tremendously valuable. And a lot of that is because of the exchange of people and ideas and concepts. I know right now the relationship is as strained as it has ever been, and it makes everything extraordinarily challenging. But when it comes to, if you just isolate space exploration, I think it's been tremendously valuable. Anyway, you look like you have more to ask.
No,
Okay.
that was my question.
Okay.
It's just that sometimes people are really, really smart coming from a country that does not invest that much, but they wish to, of course, stay in their country, work there. I want to stay in Europe, but I want to work in space, and especially at ISU, depending on where you're coming from, you have totally different opportunities to work in space and contribute, and this is not represented by their skills and knowledge.
I agree with you. I will tell you, in the history of the United States, we have brought in folks, in fact, from all over the world, but especially Germany.
That has an interesting history.
In fact, we have things named after Wernher von Braun all throughout NASA. So
we're not that proud of that part of our history.
Hello, my name is Ola from Canada. Thanks for your remarks. So as far as we know, there's basically two camps where countries can sign on to, either Artemis or ILRS. You're probably aware that last week in Vienna, there was a historic moment with UNOSA finally having a multilateral conversation about the two sets of accords.
Amen.
Yes,
love it.
amazing.
I love it.
I'm curious to know, I guess I have a two-part question. The countries who have said no to signing on to Artemis, why do you think that is, or that they seem indifferent? Why do they not care, and what's sort of the offering that could be extended? And then I personally think it would be a pretty radical act of diplomacy to sign on to the ILRS and to see mutual signatories on either side. Both Artemis Accords and ILRS are open to all countries. So as a second part, do you see any prospect to that sort of act of diplomacy?
I would love to see the two come together and work to achieve the same ends. I think that would be fantastic. There is a difference. When you think about the Artemis Accords, it's broad kind of philosophical and diplomatic kind of policies for sustainment, for sharing of information, for how to work together in space, not to interfere in the Navy. We called it due regard. I talked about using the language due regard. I'm hoping that came up at that conference. But there's a lot of law and precedent in the air domain for how countries can not interfere with each other, even if they're not directly working together. And so a lot of that is embedded in the Artemis Accords, and anybody can sign it at any time. On the ILRS, International Lunar Research Station, on that, I don't know that they have that type of broad policy kind of signatory capability. In fact, I think it's not open at all. And I could be wrong. I'd love to learn that I'm wrong. But these are all bilateral agreements between China and other countries for what they're going to provide either on the way to the moon or on the surface of the moon. So they're bilateral agreements for activity, direct activity to do stuff on the surface of the moon. And embedded in those agreements, which are not public, are maybe some broad ideas on how to work together in space. But we don't know what those are. In the Artemis Accords, we wrote in there, transparency is a key enabler of being able to work together. If there are areas where we can make it transparent, then yes, let's do that. And let's work together on a whole host of things. As far as why we're not, I want to. So I don't know why we're not. Let's do that. Let's figure out how we can work together. Yeah, please.
Sorry, the first part of the question is why have countries said no to Artemis? So if I'm Tanzania and I'm thinking about joining Artemis, why should I do that?
I can tell you, first of all, I don't know, because I think they all should. You'd have to ask them. But I do think there's a couple of different ideas out there where there's a different philosophy out there that says that anything that is extracted from the moon belongs to all of humanity. And if you have that philosophy, then nothing will ever be extracted from the moon, because there's no incentive for anybody to go. In the Artemis Accords, we suggest that if you extract lunar regolith for the purpose of whatever, or you extract lunar water, and this is law and precedent, we think about the ocean, and by the way, this comes from a lot of international law over many, many centuries. But the idea is this: if you extract tuna from the ocean, you don't own the ocean, but you can own the tuna that you extract from the ocean. Why? Because you applied your equity, your sweat, your effort to achieve that tuna that is now yours. If you extract energy from the ocean, you don't own the ocean, but you do own the energy that comes from the ocean. A lot of law and precedent around that. We tried to enshrine that concept into the Artemis Accords. Nobody owns the moon, which is perfectly in keeping with the Outer Space Treaty. Nobody owns the moon. But if you extract water ice, and you want to crack that water ice into hydrogen and oxygen and use it for propulsion, or use the oxygen for life support, or the H2O for water to drink, you can do that. You own it because you applied your sweat, your equity into achieving that resource that you extracted from the moon, just like you achieved the resource of extracting the tuna from the ocean. But you don't own the moon, and you don't own the ocean. And I think that's the philosophy that ultimately will enable all of us to go to the moon, just like all of us are able to eat fish. That's the kind of thing that we need to do, because it makes people want to go. I come from Oklahoma. Some of you might know about this university, maybe most of you don't, but we got this university called the University of Oklahoma, and they're called the Sooners. Boomer, Sooner. The reason we have Oklahoma as it is today, it was a barren land without any development, and it was illegal for people to develop it. And there were these people called the Boomers. It is named after a family called the Boomers. And the Boomers lobbied Congress to say, we want this land to be available. We want it to be developed. And so that was the purpose of the Boomers. And years later, Congress passed a law that said, if you can get to the land and you get a 40-acre parcel and you have to stay on that land, you have to make it yours, you have to live there, and you have to develop it, and if you do that, you can own the land. Well, that's how we got to the Sooners, because they picked a date and a time where if you get to the land, you can own that 40-acre parcel. Well, a bunch of people cheated. They're called Sooners. So everybody who is a fan of the University of Oklahoma, you can say that they're in fact cheaters. But they cheated. They got there soon. But here's the thing. On that day and on that time, within 24 hours, we had Guthrie, Oklahoma, and we had Oklahoma City. And each one of those towns had 10,000 people in them. They had newspapers. They had like 5 newspapers or more. They had banks. They had, all of a sudden, there was commerce there because people were able to own a resource, in this case, the land, because they wanted to grow crops, they wanted to have cattle, they wanted to homestead. That's the kind of economic activity that you get with property rights. Now, we're not talking about property rights on the moon. We're talking about getting rights to the resources just like we do with the ocean. There are some that have a philosophy that say anything that comes from outer space, whether it's the moon, whether it's Mars, whether it's an asteroid, nobody can own it. You can't own it. You can't own the resource. You can't own it. It belongs to everybody in humanity. And I think that's what will prevent us from going forward, not only to the moon, but to Mars and other places.
This is going to be the last question. Sorry, guys.
I'm Alejandro Garcia, originally from the Dominican Republic, and also proud to be U.S. citizen as well.
Awesome.
My question has to do, first, I want to thank you for what you have done with Artemis, that it has continued going to the moon, and also what you mentioned about bringing Russia and China in the 50 years. Hopefully we're going to be all together. How about the emerging nations that are presently not spacefaring yet? Yeah. What are your thoughts about to bringing them along in this wonderful journey. What are your thoughts?
50 years from now, 100%, that's going to happen. I mean, look at where we are today compared to where we were 50 years ago. Back then, it was the United States and the Soviet Union. We were both going it alone. We had Australia with us. In fact, the images of Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong came down thanks to Canberra. So Canberra. So we are so grateful for that. But my point is that was our only partner, and it was just a communication link. And we needed it because we happened to be on the wrong side of the Earth at the time that they were on the moon. So thank you. But I think the point is, if we look back then, you had Soviet Union, the United States, and then you look to where we are now, and how many different countries have space programs. And a lot of it is based on the fact that the economy continues to grow, wealth continues to spread, and countries are taking advantage of that. And if you look at a lot of those countries that didn't have space programs back then, that have them today, and you look forward, there's going to be a whole lot more countries 50 years from now that have space programs and robust GDPs per capita and a whole bunch of other things. So, no, I think absolutely there's going to be a lot of opportunity for a lot of countries. It doesn't happen overnight. But the United States, I will tell you, as NASA stands right now, is ready, willing, and able to help anybody who wants to have a space program. So, yeah.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for being here with us today. We have a little token of appreciation for your time. I know you have a very busy schedule, so we are very grateful that you're here to share all of your insights with the participants.
Thank you so much. High fives.
One last round of applause. And thank you to all of you for being very engaged and having all your questions. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for all the questions, but we do have a reception right after this across the hall, and Jim Bridenstine will join us there, so you can continue to ask more questions. So thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your evening.